Hello, everybody. Welcome to Truthworthy. This is Levi Pingleton with Catholic Apologetics International in the Kolbe Center. Visit us at robertsungenis.com, journeytothecenteroftheuniverse.com, and robertsungenis.substack.com for Catholic Apologetics International. You can visit me at levipingleton.substack.com and at my Facebook page, and also visit the Kolbe Center for the Study of Creation at kolbecenter.org. Today, what I'm going to be going through is some evidence from Hugh Owen and Robert Sungenis on the literal historical interpretation of Genesis, the immemorial custom of teaching in the authoritative teachings from the Roman Catholic Church throughout all of history. In Loved, Lost, and Found, Mr. Owen's latest book, my mentor, colleague, and friend revisits and builds upon a fascinating hypothesis regarding the origins of the book of Genesis, one originally proposed by the British scholar J.P. Wiseman in the early 20th century. This perspective, often referred to as the tablet theory, suggests that Genesis was not composed in a single moment by a single author, but rather compiled by Moses himself from a collection of much older written sources. According to this view, the earliest patriarchs, figures such as Adam, Noah, Shem, and Abraham, each recorded their own accounts of events on clay tablets, following a literary practice consistent with ancient Near Eastern cultures of their time. These tablets, carefully preserved and passed down through generations, eventually came into the hands of Moses, who acted not just as a prophet, but as a compiler and editor of these sacred histories, by the inspiration of God Himself. Owen points to a key literary feature of Genesis, the recurring phrase Toledoth, often translated as "these are the generations of," as internal evidence of this compilation process. Rather than merely serving as transitions, these statements may indicate the conclusion of an individual's written account, functioning much like colophons on ancient tablets. In this way, Genesis emerges not just as a seamless narrative authored ex nihilo, but as a carefully curated anthology of eyewitness testimonies. Furthermore, Owen notes that this model harmonizes with the biblical portrayal of Moses as as a literate and divinely appointed scribe, as seen in verses like Exodus 24:4, quote, "And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord," unquote. Far from undermining the sacred authority of Genesis, the tablet theory underscores its rootedness in history and tradition, suggesting that Moses faithfully preserved the voices of those who lived through the earliest chapters of human and divine history. Owen's treatment of the tablet theory offers a compelling alternative to modern critical models, proposing that Genesis is not merely theological reflection, but a documentary inheritance, structured, ancient, and intentionally preserved by Moses for future generations. Today, many scholars will claim that the Genesis account wasn't written by Moses and is merely a poor copy of the Enuma Elish that the Jews wrote to motivate their people and give them hope during and after their Babylonian captivity. There are major issues with this hypercritical methodology being imposed onto the interpretation of the Genesis account, and highly contradicts the immemorial customs and teaching that the Genesis creation account is a literal historical account truly written by Moses, which has been the constant tradition of the Roman Catholic Church since the beginning. The oldest surviving copies of the Enuma Elish date to the 11th century BC. The earliest that you could date them is to the 9th century BC, according to my most recent research. To date them to the 11th century, which is approximately 400 years after the time traditionally associated with Moses, and is around 1200 years after Abraham. Scholar W. G. Lambert notes that Marduk, central to the Enuma Elish, only rose to a position of officially recognized supremacy in the late 12th century BC, during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar I, according to the New Catholic Encyclopedia. This timeline actually suggests that the Hebrew tradition could have influenced surrounding pagan cultures rather than the other way around. However, many modern biblical scholars are hesitant to consider this possibility. Interpretations regarding the dates of these texts often depend heavily on underlying philosophical or methodological assumptions. Quote, the oldest extant copies of Enuma Elish come from the 11th century BC, 400 years after Moses and 1200 years after. Abraham W.G. Lambert writes, quote, has shown evidence that Marduk rose to officially sanctioned preeminence only in the late 12th century under Nebuchadnezzar I, unquote, and that is from the New Catholic Encyclopedia. If anything, this means that the likelihood is that the Hebrew tradition had influenced the surrounding pagan cultures rather than vice versa, but modern scripture scholars refuse to admit this possibility, unquote. From Robert Sungenis in the CASB, Volume 4, the Book of Genesis, chapters 1 to 11. The Enuma Elish and the Mesopotamian god Marduk are often cited as liberal, historical critical, scholarly sources, attempting to discredit the Genesis account from being a literal historical account written by Moses himself. The Pentateuch itself says that Moses is the author over a dozen times. And the earliest copy of the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish is from, could be the 9th century BC, which is the earliest I've found in my research. But really, the consensus tells us that it is likely from the 11th century BC, which gives absolutely no proof that the Enuma Elish is older than the Genesis account given by Moses. Nor does it say anything about the Pentateuch not being written by Moses. Quote, as Basil writes, we are proposing to examine the structure of the world and to contemplate the whole universe, beginning not from the wisdom of the world, but from what God taught his servant Moses when he spoke to him in person without riddles. Unquote. The Hexameron, Homily 6, 1, 1, and 1. From Robert Sungenis in the CASB, Volume 4, Genesis 1 to 11. Quote, Enuma Elish means when on high. Some of the lines of Enuma Elish read as follows, quote, when above the heaven had not been named, and below the earth had not been called by a name, when Apsu primeval, their begetter, Mumu, and Amat, he who gave birth to them all, still mingled their waters together, and no pasture land had been formed, and not even a reed march was to be seen, when none of the other gods had been brought into being, when they had not yet been called by their names, and their destinies had not yet been fixed. At that time were the gods created within them. Lamu and Lehamu came into being. They were called by their names, even before they had grown up and become tall, adding years to days. Anu was their heir presumptive, the rival of his fathers. Yeah, Anu, his firstborn, equaled Anshar. And Anu begot Nidamud. His likeness, Nidimud, the master of his fathers was he. He was broad of understanding, wise, mighty in strength, much stronger than his grandfather, Anshar. He had no rival among the gods of his brothers. Unquote. From the Babylonian Genesis, Alexander Idle, the second edition, University of Chicago Press, 1951. It is amazing that scholars would once claim that the Enuma Elish is the very model of Genesis, adding that the latter is a poor copy of the former. Enuma Elish is almost twice the length of Genesis, meandering from topic to topic. It is not a creation story, whereas Genesis clearly is. It is mythical poetry, whereas Genesis is didactic and academic, devoid of myth. Marduk appears on the scene very late, whereas Elohim is the only agent making his world. Marduk struggles, whereas Elohim merely speaks and the work is done. Marduk is picked by the gods because they want revenge, whereas Elohim is in competition with no one and serves no one. Marduk is a bloody warrior and creates mayhem, whereas Elohim creates beauty and order. Marduk is constantly agitated and anticipating his next battle, whereas Elohim rests contently after his constructive work. If anything, Enuma Elish appears to be a corrupt form of Genesis 1. Richard Clifford, S.J., in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary states, quote, in Mesopotamian culture, evidently the model for most of the stories in Genesis 1 to 11, scribes explored beginnings through stories and cosmogonies, not through abstract reasoning. Genesis 1 to 11, then, is a single story, an unusually sustained philosophical and theological explanation of the human race. The biblical writers have produced a version of a common Mesopotamian story of the origins of the populated world, exploring major questions about God and humanity through narrative, unquote. And that's from pages 8 to 9. In contrast, Bruce Vaughter in A Path Through Genesis from Sheedon Ward, 1958, and On Genesis, A New Reading Doubleday, 1977, admits that the author of Genesis 1 intentionally crafted a sharply different cosmology than the Enuma Elish. Vaughter writes, quote, Genesis took itself seriously as serious history. Genesis has been written out of an historical experience that was independent of the materials which it fashioned its history, or better, which found in these materials resonances and insights that corresponded with the experience. Genesis stands apart from the rest of the Near Eastern myth and folklore to which it is otherwise so evidently related. Unquote. On Genesis, pages 30 to 31. The contrasts are many gods versus one God. God is part of the world versus God not part of the world. Matter exists first versus God exists first. Stars help create the world versus stars being created on the fourth day. Sea creatures rival the gods versus sea creatures as mere creatures. As Sir Frederick Kenyon states, quote, there is nothing to link the Babylonian narrative to that of Genesis, unquote. From Catholic Commentary on Holy Scripture, London. Nelson, 1953, page 184. Clifford's reinterpretations of Genesis contradict the findings of the 1909 Biblical Commission. Quote, whether we may, in spite of the character and historic form of the book of Genesis, teach that the three aforesaid chapters do not contain the narrative of things which actually happened, a narrative which corresponds to objective reality and historic truth, and whether we may teach that these chapters contain fables derived from mythologies and cosmologies belonging to older nations. The answer? In the negative to each part. Unquote. Unfortunately, some Catholic exegetes have been heavily influenced by the historical critical theory that Genesis 1 was not written until the return from Babylonian captivity between 515 and 445 BC. Stanley Yockey states, quote, since Genesis 1 is, on stylistic grounds alone, patently post-exilic document, unquote, in Bible and Science, page 45. Yet Yockey equivocates in Genesis 1 through the ages, pages 25 to 26, and says that, quote, accepting higher criticism about the three or more different sources of Genesis that almost force one to date Genesis 1 as post-exilic, unquote. And that's from page 62. He traps himself, however, in his remarks on Psalm 104, after quoting, quote, you have spread out the heavens like a tent cloth. You have constructed your palace upon the waters, unquote. Yockey states that the phrase, quote, nor shall they cover the earth again, unquote, includes a post-diluvian perspective, which, quote, does not seem to bother the psalmist, unquote. This means that the psalmist would have had the information both of Genesis 1 and Genesis 7 to 9 in order to make such a comparison between the two waters. If, as Yockey claims, Genesis 1 is, quote, post-exilic, unquote, a 6th century occurrence, a 6th century BC occurrence, Psalm 104, having been written about the 11th century BC, would have no record of the waters. And thus, contrary to Yockey, Genesis 1 could not be, quote, post-exilic, unquote. We see the same sort of logic in Yockey's view that the book of Ezekiel is, quote, certainly a post-exilic product, unquote. And that's from IBID page 5. Yockey simply ignores the fact that, pardon me, Yaki simply ignores the fact that Ezekiel makes it quite clear that he is predicting and eventually in the midst of Babylonian captivity, not subsequent to it. To claim, as Yaki does, that Ezekiel is post exilic means that there is no real prophecy in Ezekiel. Rather, Ezekiel merely poses his afterthoughts as prophecy to give the false impression of divine revelation. Modern scholars do the same with Daniel. All of Daniel's prophecies are said to be written after the fact, and thus the so called prophecies are merely historical recountings, not predictions of the future. Although holding to evolution, Yaki does admit, quote, the evolution of the universe from very specific earlier states to a very specific present state. Nothing is, of course, as much as intimated in Genesis 1. Much less could one try to find there the idea of a biological evolution, unquote. Yaki also admits, quote, in other words, nothing can any longer gloss over the fact that the fossil record defies the mechanisms of evolution proposed by Darwin. The paleontological record was never known to have contained clear transitional forms, let alone a series of gentle gradations leading up to man. The only solid ground for holding evolution is the belief in the createdness of the universe, and therefore in the strict interconnectedness of all its parts, feature demanded by the infinite rationality of the Creator. Unquote. That's from IBID pages 145 to 146. It is hard to say why Yaki feels he must limit God's rationality to evolution as opposed to the instantaneous ex nihilo creation of immemorial custom and tradition in the Catholic Church. The oldest extant copies, once again, of the Animu Elish come from likely the 11th century BC, 400 years after Moses, and 1200 years after Abraham. W.G. Lambert writes, quote, has shown evidence that Marduk rose to officially sanctioned preeminence only in the late 12th century under Nebuchadnezzar I, unquote. Again, that's from the New Catholic Encyclopedia. Once again, if anything, this means that the likelihood is the Hebrew tradition had influenced the surrounding pagan cultures rather than vice versa. But modern scripture scholars, of course, refuse to even admit this as a possibility. And God bless you guys. Peace be with you. I hope that this will get you to look further into this conversation and this discussion and also see the very strong evidence from not only history and the scriptures, tradition, and the constant immemorial customs of the Catholic Church, but also in modern science that give great evidence for the literal historical interpretation of Genesis being a reasonable, rational, viable option for all of Christendom. So God bless you guys. Peace be with you. Come visit us again. Once again, visit us at robertsongenis.com, journey to the center of the universe.com, and robertsongenis.substack.com. You can visit me at levipingleton.substack.com, at my Facebook page, and yes, I do have a YouTube channel. And also visit our family, friends, and colleagues at the Kolbe Center at kolbecenter.org and kolbecenter.substack.com. God bless you guys. Peace be with you.